The Jewish people were formerly known as Banu Israel. And at that time when they were known as Banu Israel, Allah gave a promise to them. This promise was delivered to them after the holy state of Israel had been established by Nabi Dawood and Nabi Sulaiman alayhim salam. And after that state had collapsed upon the death of Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam, and after it had been attacked and destroyed by a Babylonian army, and the Israelite people had been enslaved and taken into exile in Babylon. All of this is Jewish history, but also it is covered in the Quran. It was at that time when they were in Babylon that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala delivered a promise to them through His prophets, that He was going to send someone who would be known as the Messiah, and that He would be their prophet, and that He would restore the golden age when the holy state of Israel was established in the Holy Land, and it had become the ruling state in the world, and the Israelite people, will once again rule the world. This was the promise which was delivered to them about the advent of the Messiah. And we know that Allah allowed them to return to the Holy Land after some time in exile in Babylon. And we know that the temple was rebuilt, but the Holy Land remained under Roman rule. And we know that Allah did send the Messiah to them, but He tested them. Some of them passed the test, and they accepted Nabi Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, the son of the Virgin Mary, as the Messiah. But others failed the test because they said, وَنَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ هَذَا, he's a bastard, because his mother was not married. Allah tested them and they failed the test. When he became an adult, he said, I am the Messiah. But they rejected him. They rejected him among other reasons because Allah tested them, as I said earlier, and they failed the test. And so they rejected him as the Messiah, and they believe that the Messiah is still to come. And that's where we took up that passage in the book. They are still waiting for the Messiah to come 2,000 years later. It is a cardinal article of faith for these people that Allah's promise must be fulfilled, the Messiah must come. After the attempted crucifixion, Allah no longer refers to them as Banu Israel. No. Now they are divided into two. One part of Banu Israel, which accepted Nabi Isa alayhi salam as the Messiah, they are now known as Nasara, the Christians. And I have explained elsewhere why Allah used the term Nasara for them and what's the meaning of Nasara. And the other part which rejected him as the Messiah was now known as Al-Yahud, and the English translation will be Jews. And these two combined, who are all formerly Banu Israel, are now called Ahlul Kitab. So they are waiting for the Messiah to come. And 2,000 years have passed and they're still waiting. But the Quran affirms that the Messiah came and the Messiah left. And there is ample evidence from the Quran that the Messiah will return. But they don't accept that he was the Messiah. There are only two people on the face of the earth who accept Nabi Isa alayhi salam as the Messiah. Only two. They are those Israelites who followed him and accepted him as Messiah, and are today known as Nasara or Christians. And there is the Ummah of Muhammad, Allah's blessing be upon him, who because of the Quran, they also accept him as the Messiah. Both the Quran and the Christian community, both of them have this belief that before the Messiah returns, Allah is going to send someone whom Allah has created. And he is an evil being. Can Allah create an evil being? The Quran says, بَعَيَوْذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ مِنْ شَرِّ مَا خَلَقَ. Yes, the Quran has affirmed that Allah can create evil, and if He can create evil, then He can create an evil being. And that evil being, our Prophet has described him as Al-Masih al-Dajjal. Dajjal, the evil being who has a PhD in deception and who wants to impersonate the Messiah. So he's the great pretender, the great impersonator. And he will be sent into the world, and he will make his appearance as a human being eventually, just before the true Messiah is to come. And when the true Messiah comes, he's going to kill this false Messiah. And now what we have is a process known as logical deduction. It is a part of the process of thinking that we should be able to deduce matters logically. That is part of the process of thinking, logical deduction. And Allah Ta'ala has affirmed again and again in the Quran that He sent the Quran لِقَوْمِ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. He sent the Quran to people who think. And He condemns those who don't think. إِنَّ الشَّرَّ الدَّوَّابِ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ الصُّمُّ الْبُكْمُ الَّذِينَ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. That the worst creatures with Allah are the deaf and the dumb who don't think. So we have the right to think, and we have the right to engage in logical deduction. But when we do so, the sheep and the cattle who refuse to think, show me the hadith, show me the hadith, show me the hadith, we don't have time to waste with them. So if the Messiah is to come, and He is to restore the holy state of Israel in the Holy Land, and rule from that holy state of Israel, the Jews believe that one of the first things He will have to do, because the Holy Land is under Muslim rule for more than 1,000 years, one of the first things He will have to do is to liberate the Holy Land for the Jews. Has this happened as yet? Unless you're eating your couscous and going home and sleep, of course everybody would know that the modern Western world, the Western civilization, led by Britain, did achieve that. They first of all launched something known as the Crusades. And then after several Crusades, it was a British general who led a British army with many Muslims fighting faithfully behind him in that army, to their eternal shame and disgrace. and they defeated the Ottoman Empire, and that General Allenby, when he entered Jerusalem, he said that today the Crusades have ended. And so the Western world, led by Britain, did succeed in liberating the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Number two, not only must the Holy Land be liberated, but since Allah had expelled the Jews and banned them from returning, the Jews must first be brought back to the Holy Land. And in the Quran we know that it is Gog and Magog who will take a people back to a town which Allah destroyed. And we have identified that as Jerusalem. So when the Western world liberated the Holy Land in 1917, they then spent the period from 1917 to 1948 of 30 years, and they brought Jews back to the Holy Land. But the Jews who were brought back to the Holy Land were not Banu Israel. They had no genetic links at all with the Israelite people. These were European peoples who had converted to Judaism. So European Jews, not Banu Israel. But since the Quran no longer uses the term Banu Israel, the implication is that you can be a Jew and not be an Israelite. You can be a Christian and not be an Israelite. That is why the Quran no longer uses the term Banu Israel. So the Jews are brought back to the Holy Land and they reclaim it as their own. But that's not enough. They have to restore a holy state of Israel in the Holy Land. And in 1948, that's what they did. And a state of Israel was established. And it was a secular state, but they said this is Holy Israel. But not only that, they need to establish Holy Israel and make it a ruling state in the world. And we have mentioned in the Quran, in Surah Al-Mursalat, the shadowy three parts. We have identified it with Pax Britannica, Pax Americana. And we are now located at a moment in time when Pax Americana must make way for Pax Judaica. That's why Israel is flexing her muscles at this time, so that Israel can replace the United States as the next ruling state in the world. And when Israel claims to be the next ruling state in the world, which is after the Great War, it is only at that time that the shadow will disappear, and we have interpreted the shadow to be Dajjal, the false Messiah. And then he will make his appearance in human form. And from Jerusalem, he will declare, Ana al-Masih. And all the Jews who lack the capacity to see with the internal eye, basar, they will be deceived and they will accept him as the Messiah. It was at that time, after he has completed his mission, that Allah will then send, number one, the Imam al-Mahdi, alayhi salam, and then after that, Nabi Isa alayhi salam will return, and he will then kill Dajjal. And after he kills Dajjal, then Gog and Magog will be destroyed by Allah himself in Jerusalem. And then the Muslim army will then liberate the Holy Land. It will come from Khorasan. Our prophets say when that army marches from Khorasan, no one will be able to stop it. After the Muslim army liberates Jerusalem, the Holy Land, the Jews will be fleeing. Today they are arrogant, ruling and oppressing the Muslims, fighting them, starving them to death, denying them food, denying them water, denying them the capacity to even live in their land, destroying the land where they're living in Gaza. It is awesome oppression. But at that time, when the Muslim army is liberating the Holy Land, Allah's Messenger said, they'll be hiding behind rocks and stones, and the rocks and stones will speak and say, "Oh Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." Not all Jews. Not a Jew who is denouncing Israeli oppression, as there are Jews in the world. We're talking about the Jews who are oppressors. At that time, when the Holy Land is liberated, then we will already have a Khilafah state in Mecca, because Imam al-Mahdi will be leading us. And there will now be another Khilafah state in Jerusalem, because Nabi Isa alayhi salam is not sent to the Ummah of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Be careful, be careful, be careful to remove this brainwashing which has taken grip of the Muslim mind. It is Allah who decides, not you. And Allah has decided that Nabi Isa alayhi salam was to be sent to one people. Ya Bani Israel, inni Rasulullahi ilaykum. This is the Quran declaring that Jesus is sent to the Israelite people. Jesus, Nabi Isa, is not sent to all of mankind. He's not sent to the Ummah of Muhammad alayhi salatu. So if he is to rule the world from Jerusalem, and our Prophet confirmed it, he said that when he returns, he would be Hakimul Adil, Hakim from Hukuma, a ruler, and he would rule with justice. So that state over which he rules has to be the ruling state in the world. And he would be the head of state of that ruling state in the world. And that cannot be the Khilafah state in Mecca. So there are going to be two Khilafah states. One in Mecca, which is led by Imam al-Mahdi, and another one which is the ruling state in the world. That one will be in Jerusalem, which is led by Nabi Isa alayhi salam. And that is how history will end.